So, dear friends, my name is Anton. I work at Mattereum, uh, and we're very happy to see so many of you here today. Real-world assets are arriving on the blockchain. Mattereum has existed for nearly 5 years, and we've been working in the space for a number of years. And more companies and individuals are coming into the space. So today it's great to have our first physical asset NFT meetup and to celebrate physical asset NFTs and to hear from folks who are working in the space about what's new and what's exciting. And we hope to cover a number of topics. Obviously, we're going to discuss hard assets on chain and bridging the gap between the physical and the digital worlds. We hope to discuss vaulting physical NFTs for global brands. We'll discuss collateralizing crypto, lending with alternative investment assets, and we will discuss how NFTs with legal contracts can stop counterfeiting. So welcome, everybody. A couple of bits of information. So there is a Google sheet for the purpose of networking, which we're going to flash up in the chat. So if folks want to share their details to be able to connect with one another, to be able to get in touch after the event, please do add your details to that so that people are able to contact each other. There is also a link on the Google sheet with a sign up, with the possibility to sign up to Mattereum's newsletter. So we've got a number of, it's going to be a very informal event, but we've got a number of items that we'd like to get through. We'll have a fireside chat between Teej from MakerDAO and Vinay Gupta, who is the founder and CEO of Mattereum. There'll be a few short panels looking at some of the exciting asset classes and sub-asset classes where live work is happening right now. And there will also be an opportunity to ask questions. And then on a separate Zoom link, there will be a kind of after party, which will be a much more pub kind of vibe and an opportunity for people to get a drink and to mingle and to network much less formally. We also have a POPE, a proof of attendance token, which will be made available to the first 50 attendees, which is yeah, we already have more than 50 folks, so it'll be available to the first 50 attendees. Now the question that I have before we move into the next session is, do we have Teej from MakerDAO here or not yet? Do we have Teej?
No, doesn't look like he's here yet. I've just sent him a reminder. I did talk to him in the last hour, so I'm expecting him to be here.
Okay, well,
could it be stuck as an attendee? Should we have a quick check there?
Yeah, let's have a quick check. Dom, can you see Teej anywhere?
No, I don't.
Okay, so he's an attendee. Well, in that case, perhaps so we've got a number of people who are working in the space, covering a number of asset classes. I think there is a lot to discuss. So perhaps we can move into one of our panels first. And I'm wondering we've got a panel on wine and whiskey. We have a panel on real estate, and we have a panel on fine art and collectibles. We were going to start with the fireside chat, but I am wondering whether we should start with one of the panels. Vinay, do you think we should maybe start with the real estate panel, because I can see the participants of that panel who are already here? Or maybe we could start with the wine panel, because I can see everybody is here already.
Yeah, if we have a full panel for wine, why don't we start with wine?
All right. So I think I can see all of the attendees here for the wine panel. which is great news. So without further ado, let us launch into that. And we've got Dave Garret of Club DVN, and we've got, I think we've got Thomas Williams of WIV. Do we have Thomas? Do we have Thomas? Yes. No?
I can't see him. Yeah, it might be in the attend. Let me check the participants.
Perhaps not.
No.
And we do have Adam Ghahramani. Sorry if I got your name wrong, Adam, from Hello Fam. So since we don't have Thomas yet, should we start the panel anyway and Thomas can join, or should we wait for a moment? I think let's start and Thomas can join. All right, in that case, so first of all, I would like all of our wine panelists. Oh yes, and we've got Ketan Keshwala from Mattereum, who has been working with a wine merchant from the Mattereum end. So perhaps we could ask everybody who is on the panel to just spend 1 minute or so introducing themselves and talking about their work and talking about their project. And then we could take a few short factual questions from the audience and then move on to the next panel. And there'll be the opportunity for a wider Q&A for all participants a little bit later on. So who would like to start? Adam, maybe you could start by saying a few words about your work and introducing yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Anton, and thank you all so much for having me here. My name is Adam Ghahramani. You're close enough on the last name.
Ghahramani. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
So
nobody can pronounce my name either.
Yeah. I co-founded 2 projects. The first is Untamed Elephants, which was the first ever charity NFT project over 12 months ago. And the second, which is why I'm here, is called Hello Fam, which was the first NFT wine brand, also launched a year ago. It's coming up to our 1-year birthday. So Hello Fam is a joint production between us and a company called Vincent, which helps 100 wineries sell direct to consumer. We issue NFTs where the wine is stored somewhere else. You could buy, sell, trade the NFTs, and it represents physical wine stored in a temperature-controlled, bonded facility. So that's me.
Great, thank you. David, could you introduce yourself and say a little bit about your work, please?
Sure. I'm Dave Garret, the co-founder of Club Divin. And let me just start by saying Adam and Hello Fam was a huge inspiration for us. I remember watching it go live. I know Gil and Jacob pretty well. So congratulations on being the first out there with the wine project. It was really, really fascinating to see. We focus on a different part of the wine, I guess, life cycle. We're much more interested in after the wine leaves the bonded warehouse. We keep track of chain of custody, and then we actually have a kind of an interesting thing where we want to incentivize people to let us know when they've opened the bottle. So we've created a not just an NFT that goes along with the bottle until it's opened, but then the ability for when they open the bottle for people to be able to mint new NFTs that are kind of like POAPs, that we call tasting token NFTs, which are an authentic proof of experience for people that have tasted the wine.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And we've got now Thomas on the panel. Thomas, we've started with the conversation about wine and spirits. So may I please ask you to just spend a minute introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me today. Sorry, just fixing this. Thanks for having me today. So I work at WIV Technology. I work there as one of the product development leads and data analysts. So a few different roles. It's a startup. So essentially what we are trying to do is really take wine as an investment asset to another level. So by offering wine in a lot of different ways and globally, to allow investors to both invest in wine in a much more easy way, to invest in wine as a passive investment, and then to also potentially financialize wine to the point where it can be used in DeFi and in different types of financial schemes as a form of collateral, because wine, as we know, is a very, very powerful investment asset. It actually returned 25% year over year this last year, and historically over the last 20 years returns around 9% annually, and it has much lower volatility than a lot of other assets. So the ability to invest in an asset that's as stable and as appreciative like wine, and then actually potentially use it as collateral, take out a loan and do other types of things, whether it's in DeFi or whether it's just to be a passionate collector of wine and then be able to have some liquidity on it, is something that we see as a very powerful opportunity in the wine industry. So that's a little bit. I'm happy to answer any other questions if that wasn't clear.
Great, thank you very much, Thomas. And Ketan, could you say a little bit about the work that you've been doing on wine, or and more specifically whiskey, actually?
Yeah, so nice to meet the rest of the panel. Really interesting backgrounds. This space is incredibly fascinating, and it's quite a traditional industry, but it's sort of embracing some of this new stuff around blockchain, NFTs. The securitization side is interesting as well in this space. So we've been working with a client. I think, David, you're very aware of them. Vinay may have mentioned it on one of your own podcasts with IG Wines. We've entered into a partnership with them recently. They're a traditional wine merchant with a network of stores, and they sell fine wines through that store, but they also have an investment wine angle to their business as well. So we're partnered with them to essentially look at blockchain type solutions for this space. Our first project will be co-developing a solution for the whiskey industry. So they're selling large casks, and they're looking to basically sell those to different investors. And the whiskey barrels at the moment are incredible. It's a hot area. They seem to be selling and in high demand. So I think they just sold one for £1.5 million to a single buyer, actually, that one. But our project will be about looking to securitize that. So I've been working with Mattereum about 15 months. My background is essentially I was a CEO of 7 different organizations, put an umbrella organization on top of it. And then prior to that, I was head of commercial within the Home Office, which for the people who are not in the UK, that is equivalent to Interior Department or a State Department in some other countries. I was managing the Olympics delivery for the department initially, and then I went on to do larger and larger commercial engagements within that department for over a course of 9-10 years. And then prior to that, I was a management consultant within KPMG Boxwood, dealing with operational turnarounds. But my background is as an engineer. I'm a structural civil. I did my first 2 degrees in there. My MBA was through scholarship, and I graduated in 2010. So I'm very interested in the business angle and the use of this new technology in what can be quite traditional industries, such as wine and spirits area, and how we can almost use this as a transformational force to make these areas more efficient. The main target being the large fraud levels in this industry generally. David, I know, has got fantastic little factoids about that side of things, but it's commonly talked about 30% of fraud is endemic in the industry, which is huge. So yeah, if any technology can bring that to a more manageable level, sounds like it could have a good place.
Well, and I hope throughout the evening we will, more than one panelist will address the issue of counterfeiting. So I would like folks to invite folks to either ask questions by posting them in the Q&A tab, or raising their hand if they would like to speak. And we're going to take a couple of questions per panel, and then we'll take more questions for everyone in the Q&A. So if folks have specific questions about wine or spirits, and obviously hard asset NFTs linked to wine and spirits, please do ask them. And whilst you think of your question or you type out your question, I am going to start. And I am going to start by picking up on something which a couple of the panelists have already touched on. And my question is, obviously, this is a new area and this is a new technology, and we're all working to disrupt traditional industry. What is the biggest opportunity, do you think, in the space, specifically for wine and for spirits? And perhaps we can start in the order that folks introduce themselves, and we'll do the next set of answers in reverse order. So Adam, perhaps you can start, if indeed you feel this is a reasonable question.
Yeah, sure. So the question is, what's the biggest opportunity?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've been in crypto since 2013, and tokenizing real world assets has been something that I've heard since 2013, and it really hasn't taken off at all until NFTs in the last year. And I think part of that is because NFTs bring kind of more of a sense of ownership, where you have the art. If every wine bottle had no art on the label, I mean, how far would the branding go? But with NFTs, you can actually have kind of a visual dynamic. You can have a portfolio of what you own. So the big opportunity is we're finally seeing the tokenization of physical and with younger people that I've talked to with Hello Fam, our audience skews a little younger, is a lot of them love collecting, but they don't have like wine cellars. They don't have space. They're used to having all of their assets be digital. They have their crypto bank account. They don't use cash. They use crypto, etc. And they love alternative assets, like, you know, Pokemon cards are really big for the younger set. Metaverse digital assets are. So the future for the upcoming generation is all digital assets, and they'd love to collect wine. And NFTs kind of combine alternative assets with what they're comfortable with kind of the digital Gen Z native platform. So yeah, so lots of opportunities, and that's where I see it.
Thank you, Adam. David, we come to you next. And again, please answer if you feel it is a valid question. You're muted.
Sorry about that. What's the biggest value? For me, you know, I think that there's value in a ton of places. I really love what some of the other folks are doing here in investment. I do think there's a huge opportunity in investment. What we really look at and what we think is an enormous value is data and community. That's kind of where we live. Data is really interesting in the wine business because typically, you know, the distance between a winemaker and a consumer is 15 years and 15,000 miles, right? Like when you open a bottle of wine, that was made by someone a long time ago in a place far, far away. And the data really gets lost. Most winemakers, it's a very atomized industry. All the winemakers that I know, as soon as the wine leaves their shop, maybe they know where individual boxes are going, but after that, they all get lost in the wild. And without that data, it's really hard for winemakers to decide what they want to make great business decisions. They don't even know when their wines are being consumed, much less where they're being consumed or who's consuming them. So I think that data is really important. And then I also think community is really important. Again, that separation of 15 years and 15,000 miles makes it really difficult to create community. But with NFTs, not only are you collecting data, but with what we're doing with tasting tokens, it really allows the winemaker to be in contact with the consumer at the moment of consumption,
Mhm.
and kind of start to shape culture and community around that. So I know that those things are less not so much DeFi, but they're really interesting for me as being someone from the wine industry. Like, those are just great values to unlock.
Thank you very much, and I'm already hearing some themes emerging, and I think they will continue to solidify throughout the evening as we speak more. Thomas, again, if you feel my question is valid, perhaps you could comment.
Yeah, definitely. I'll build off the last two answers to answer that a bit more. So I think you have something, the authentication and the digitization process, and then you have the financialization process. They do play together, but they're also a bit separate in terms of bringing value. And I think from the digitization process, in order for everything that David was saying about the data and the information being available, the technology does need to catch up and become a bit more accessible in improving that process. And I think that's why we have been hearing, like Adam saying, these physical assets being on blockchain for so long, because the concept's there and it's valid. The technology in terms of some other areas like IoT, NFTs haven't really broken out until this year. And also the aspect of the UX and the UI in the current crypto space haven't fully caught up to make these more, to make these really adaptable products yet. But just like with the internet, that will come and things will change. But for now, I would say focusing on the area that adds the most value, authenticating and quantifying the entire industry is an area that's really, really powerful. If you're able to get information on every harvest, on all these different winemakers, either making that somewhat public or fully public, you allow an entire industry to bloom and value to be added in a lot of different ways, whether it's preventing fakes or whether it's allowing there to be a better investment market that can really grow the industry, like we've seen with commodities over the last couple of decades as investment assets. So yeah, I think I don't know if that answered the question directly, but that's really what I see. The ability to quantify the industry, make it digital, and then financialize it on top of that is where there's going to be a lot of value. And it's, I think, a few different steps to get there. And there's different technologies that need to be developed in order for that process to work really, really well.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And before I come to Ketan, again, I'd like to say, if anybody has got a specific question for this panel to do with wine, to do with spirits, please either put it in the Q&A dialogue or raise your hand, and we will invite you to speak. So moving on to Ketan. Again, if you feel my question is valid, perhaps you could comment.
I think I'll be quite modest here and say, look, the wine and spirits industry is a massive industry. It's been going for hundreds of years, pretty much as David said. I think it's slightly okay to say at this point, we don't know what the biggest opportunity is because it's still developing. Whether product market fit is fully there yet is a question.
Yeah, internet center.
Sorry, somebody is cutting through. Could you mute? Thank you.
I think I bored someone to death and they fainted. I apologize for that. It's a usual effect. My wife is well aware of that condition. I was just saying, I think we might not know yet, but I do think there's enough feature sets in the ability of blockchain and the irrefutable, immutable facts of something being entered has wide applicability, not just to this industry, but others. So I think the challenge for us as on the tech side, at least, not just the industry side, is to work out decent partnerships in which we can start to explore those solutions. Because when we do that, then the reality of how business is done now can start to address these new technologies. And I think for me, if you're asking an opportunity question, which you are, Anton, the opportunity is size of the current market, really, because it would be a transformation of the current industry using new technology would really redefine things. So it's really big, but I don't think we could really say where the sweet spots are yet. But I do want to build on something David mentioned. I think there's something, I don't want to go too romantic about it, but the whole spirits and wines industry, there's stories behind things, isn't it? There's people experiencing the joy of drinking the fine wine or the bottle, but there's also this sort of story how that wine bottle got here through the vineyard and all of that. I think we kind of, in our Mattereum way of thinking about things, we introduce a Mattereum asset passport. So we're trying to passport the historical provenance aspects of the asset in our asset passporting process, and that includes not just the provenance aspects of where it came from, which vineyard, who certifies it, what insurance is behind it, all of that stuff. But there's something about capturing that story in an information layer that is around this asset. So I think I quite like the applicability of that part. We just need a happy home where somebody really embraces that new functionality for me. So that's all I have to say on it.
Thank you, Ketan. So we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, and there is one addressed to Thomas, but I think others may respond to how Thomas to what Thomas says to this. And the question, I'll read it out. It's in the Q&A dialogue. You said you would like to use wine as collateral. Are NFTs suitable for this, as they're not really liquid and divisible? How would you like to make this happen? Are there ERC 7-to-1 liquidity pools in a way? So Thomas, I think it's a question for you, but I think everybody else should be able to comment on that as well.
So what I was saying there was more focused on the idea that wine as an asset is something that has become more liquid over time in terms of your ability to trade it. And that's happened through technology. What NFTs have the ability to do is take that to another level while proving provenance, if with the correct technology is attached to the NFT. And then what you can do there is, because it's stored in a token, you can actually provide ownership or title over to an entity, and that entity can then hold that and then allow you to take a loan on it, where traditionally that value transfer couldn't have happened in a physical form, or it could have. It would have to be it would have been very difficult. So that's where the opportunity is here with the NFT as collateral, but there are levels to get there. So right now, what we're proposing is that a more centralized entity who can actually custody physical bottles and offer digital tokens to customers works also as that entity that offers out the loan on that collateral. In the long run, the vision would be that that could just be global and it wouldn't have to be as centralized, and that the NFT actually worked as the legal title or right over that NFT, over that physical asset. So we're in a little bit of a middle point right now. So that's the way I would answer that question.
Do any of the other panelists have something to add on that, on the point of liquidity? Adam, David, Ketan, anything to add on that?
I did. I really like what Thomas had to say, but David, did you want to come in on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, look, wine has been a liquid asset for a long time. Berry Brothers, as a centralized, as a centralized platform, Berry Brothers has probably been doing that for 130 years. So it's the ability to be able to trade wine, to even borrow against your assets that are in a centralized location, that's been around for a long time. Using NFTs to do that really, I think, provides, and again, the vision long term of what Thomas is talking about, to be able to do that in a decentralized way globally. It's going to require some technology, but it's I think the liquidity is probably already there. The only problem with liquidity is right now there's not a lot of price differential. So if you were to get on, Wine Searcher and look for a 2003 Chateau Palmer Alter Ego, right? You're going to find a couple hundred bottles somewhere around the world, and the price differential is going to be somewhere around 5 to 10%, right? It'll all be around the same price. The problem is that all those different bottles have very different provenance. Some of them maybe have been sitting in a bonded warehouse for 19 years, and some of them may have traded all around the world. An owner in Hong Kong, an owner in California, an owner in Dubai. And so without knowing the chain of custody and without having that information transparent and immutable, it's really hard to have real price differential in those two different bottles. But with the technology I know that Thomas is building and some of the technology that we're doing, that price differential is not only going to create a lot more liquidity in the market, but it's also going to be a huge disincentive against fraud and counterfeit, and an incentive to have more perfect provenance. So I think the liquidity is probably there. The technology is going to increase liquidity dramatically.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Thank you. Adam, did you want to add anything on the liquidity point?
So for liquidity and for collateral, I'll broadly say that with our two Hello Fam wines, it was kind of magical. We launched a year ago to launch a completely new wine brand. The wine bottles aren't physically released yet. They're getting close, but to have secondary trading volume on OpenSea with no middleman actually happen. It's pretty magical to me that NFTs enable kind of a new level of liquidity, because there's liquidity for like super well-known blue chip wines if you go through these centralized platforms, but decentralized liquidity for brand new wines is unheard of. So that's been super exciting. And on the collateral part, I'll say in the broader NFT market, it's pretty cutting edge. There are some platforms where you could deposit your blue chip NFTs as collateral and take out loans, like your Bored Apes, etc. But those are only for like the biggest, like super traded assets. So it's still a developing area for smaller assets.
Thank you, Adam. Ketan, did you want to add anything before we conclude this specific topic and move on? There'll be opportunity to discuss more broadly some of the things we touched on in the Q&A and then later in the networking. But do you have something?
Just a quick sum up, right? I mean, the panelists obviously are working the different parts of the problem here. You're trying to bond an NFT, bond it to physical items. How do you do that? Is that through some of the blockchain technology side of having hashes that are unique, or are they the legal protections? And I think I was quite taken by what Thomas was trying to solve there. And I think Mattereum was also aware of that issue. How does an NFT represent legal ownership of the asset? Big problem, right? It's kind of, I think we spent 3 years on that. Anton is hiding behind a bit of modesty here, but he spent a long time developing that in the UK using UK JT laws about arbitration, and we're proud of the work we've done there about putting in place systems by which we can enforce through arbitration ownership of assets through NFTs. And this is even better than that. The benefit of an arbitration mechanism that we can implement through our approach allows you to resolve disputes around ownership using an NFT in 168 odd jurisdictions. So it's fascinating. We should really talk, Thomas. I think some of that may be helpful. But I think it's just a general problem in bonding the physical to the NFT. There's lots of different ways you need to make that work.
Okay, well, thank you, Ketan. Okay, so I think let's conclude the wine topic specifically, because we've still got quite a lot to get through. As I say, we will be able to interact with all of the panelists during the Q&A later on broader issues, as well as during the networking session. So for now, I'd like to thank all of our wine panelists, and it sounds like you're all working on incredibly important, incredibly interesting parts of the problem, as Ketan said. I can see that Teej from Maker DAO is now here. So Teej, Vinay, are you comfortable now to move into your fireside chat, and then perhaps after that we can take a couple of questions, then take a break, and then we'll do the remaining topics, and then we can go and grab a beer and do some networking. Is that okay? Can we move into the fireside chat now?
Absolutely, good to go here.
Great. Well, in that case, without further ado, Vinay, Teej, thank you very much for the opportunity to hear you have this conversation, and over to you.
Great. Good to meet you. So I guess quick intros. I'm Vinay, CEO of Mattereum, was the release coordinator for Ethereum in 2015. So actually ran the launch process. Before that, no, it's long stories. Tell us what hats you're wearing today. Like, I know you're wearing a couple of different hats. You're at Maker, you're also the VC. Just give us a little bit of background so people know who you are.
Yeah, sure. So I would say my primary hat is one of onboarding real world assets at MakerDAO. I'm sure many on this call are very familiar with what we're doing there, but basic premise is historically Maker's focus on crypto collateral, and I'm trying to build out just as robust a process for onboarding stuff from the real world. My other hat is I do have a small fund, primarily liquid positions, focused on the long term as well.
Cool. So tell us a bit about the sort of Maker strategy when it comes to real world assets and collateralization. Like, the high level, but also what are the kind of gory technical details that are most difficult to resolve?
Sure. So look, I mean, I think many folks kind of agree that for DeFi to kind of fulfill its potential, we've got to build these rails to the real world. There's 650 trillion of real world asset value out there between real estate, fixed income, and equity. And our impressive but small world of crypto is 1 trillion, right? So if we're trying to be a money, really, for successful money to grow, you need a network effect. And so you need lots of places to export that DAI, lots of good collateral in different jurisdictions, on-chain, off-chain, to mint DAI against. And so we're saying, well, we know real world assets are a part of kind of the scaling strategy for a successful maker, but specifically, how do we keep things in mind, like our liquidity considerations, our kind of strategic objectives in terms of regulation, the sort of alignment with external managers, external protocols, originators. How do we make sure all those things are structured in a way that we can go look at DAI holders and maker holders and say, look, the security, consistency, and reliability you're used to historically when you mint DAI, nothing's changed here. We're just making the collateral base more dynamic. We're bringing more consistent yield into the mix. And as real world rates go up, right, and demand for crypto leverage drops, it's kind of a nice carry trade to be able to put a flexible balance sheet in crypto when it's more appealing there, and in the real world when it's more appealing there. To answer your second question in terms of what's most complicated, I think in the early days before, everything kind of deterministically lives on chain, whether it's crypto stuff or real world stuff, there's a lot of, there are a lot of growing pains, right? And we need to kind of deal with risk assets and the traditional structures they live within, in a way that's not quite as trustless as people in crypto are accustomed to, right? And that educational process and even just building out those rails, it takes time and it's complicated, but we're committed to doing it right. We see kind of what the North Star is, and we know kind of how to get there, but it does take time.
Mm-hmm. Talk a bit about the sort of distinction between things like centrifuge, where you have essentially revenue streams going in, versus the kind of holy grail of real estate. How does this stuff get talked about inside of Maker?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I would draw the distinction between real estate and a centrifuge. What I would say is centrifuge is really it's an infrastructure partner, right? What they're really trying to do is they're kind of sitting there in the middle and they're saying, well, okay, Maker, I mean, you want to onboard fixed income assets from the real world, but you'd like to do so in a way that is more crypto native. And so what they've put forth is effectively a tokenization solution, right? That takes an asset and it slices it into two tokens, a senior and a junior. So this is sort of, the beginnings of on-chain securitization that you're seeing, right? And so the way Maker works, right, is typically we want to mint DAI against a token in a vault somewhere, right? And so if you're just onboarding real estate, that is obviously doesn't mesh all that well with a system where Maker would like to keep collateral in a vault. Centrifuges come along and they've said, well, we can sort of be the translator between real estate and loans and trade receivables in the real world. Create a tokenization solution, a structured one, senior, junior, and then you can take that senior token and Maker can mint DAI against that, right? So there are a bunch of partners like that. They're doing fascinating stuff in kind of the middleware space, whether it's Maple or TrueFire, Centrifuge, really trying to build all those pieces so we can get to the point where all this stuff lives on chain. I would say the other side of the business, we recently did a deal with a US regulated bank, which was not on Centrifuge. That was much more traditional in nature, right? Which, as you can imagine, if you're dealing with traditional counterparties, especially those with long reputations, you want to do things in a way that makes sense to them, right? So you can't just jam crypto on them. You would like to innovate on structure, but in general, we use very traditional legal and commercial structures to make them comfortable, because I think it was a good symbiotic deal for both parties.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, this kind of real world bridging stuff is, we used to talk about this notion of the Ricardian contract. And the Ricardian contract in its purest form to the legal world just looks like another paper contract, and to the blockchain world just looks like another smart contract. And at no point does the thing kind of betray its hybrid nature to either side. Everybody sees it as being native to the environment that they're in. The fact that it's a weird technical artifact that bridges this way, they just never see. And what do you think the sort of future is for real world assets in the sort of broader sense on chain, right? So we've got, the issuance of currency against those assets in the Maker context. Tell me a little bit about what else you see in that future.
Yeah, so look, I think if we fulfill the potential of DeFi with regard to, building capital markets fit for an internet age, like the long term is, there's no distinction between real world assets and crypto assets, right? Because everything just lives on crypto rails. It's kind of like all information now lives on the internet. That's the native medium. We are trying to create a new native medium for our value. Yeah. I think for that to come to fruition, you basically need this middleware to all be attacked and made more trustless. So even something as basic as the oracles, right? In my view, you can tokenize these assets, you can bring them on chain, you can mint currency against them. But even just the accounting of the assets themselves, what's their value? How do you surveil the change in performance? How do you account for that change in performance? And how do you ship that data transparently and robustly on chain? Right. So I think things like the Oracle will be built out trustlessly. I think things like the tokenization infrastructure will be built out trustlessly. So when I think something even like the server.
Yeah, go ahead. Are you thinking trustlessly in a kind of crypto economic sense of like, if the information coming in is inaccurate, then somebody gets a stake slashed? Or are you thinking trustlessly as in something more kind of zero knowledge proof flavored, where you actually literally it can't be wrong?
No, that's a great question. And of course we realize that nothing is truly trustless, right? Can you still hear me okay? I think my connection's going out a little bit.
Yeah, you're loud and clear, no glitch.
So yeah, I mean, I think that the first piece, having a sort of more distributed data input to these systems, whereby you have a mechanism for carving off outliers and basically triangulating the truth. I think that's for sure one piece. So
the chain link is like lots and lots and lots
correct.
Of data sources into So a redundancy.
Correct. Yes, a redundancy, and I think that takes. I think people underestimate how much time it takes for those networks to be up and running with reputations building and slashing occurring, for them to be actually better replacements for our existing real world oracles. I mean, if you think about existing real world oracles, these are individuals who have spent their careers understanding the nature of the underlying assets, right? It takes time to build a decentralized redundant system that compares to the efficacy of that. In other words, are you going to, pull a sports score from Augur, or are you going to pull a sports score from ESPN? ESPN has a whole career of reputation and truth behind it. But so that's kind of the slashing piece, a redundancy to the data coming on chain. I think the other piece that you you mentioned is super interesting and absolutely where we're going. The question is basically, if you're onboarding assets from the real world and your idea is to be transparent about the reporting, about the nature of these assets, we need to be very careful about consumer protections and verifying that information is in fact correct without revealing sensitive information, right? And this is a perfect ZK solution. We're not quite there yet, but there are people working on it that will effectively be able to verify to DAI holders or to anyone on chain that, you know, collateral is in fact what it is. It's located where it is. Someone said something about this collateral at some time. It was signed on chain. So I think we're going there. I think both of those mechanisms you mentioned will play a role, but I think they take time. I think that's kind of the theme.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Mattereum approach to this stuff is that we do the resolution of this stuff on the legal side of the bridge rather than on the digital side of it. So when somebody has an asset that they want to use in the system, what we wind up with is multiple entities of demonstrated solvency who write legal warranties against the valuable attributes of the asset. And in the event of a dispute, that stuff gets resolved in an arbitration court and then it settles against an insurance policy, or we can generate a court order and sell physical assets like real estate to make people whole. Whoops, did we lose Teej? Maybe just this video. And you're back. So that I was just saying that in the Mattereum system, you know, when you have the physical assets, the tie to the real world and the certification of valuable attributes is that you have real world experts who have collateral which is accessible not to a slashing of stake on chain, but direct access by court order. And that means that we can basically have the assets collateral, have the assets warranted and guaranteed with accessible funds that can be reached in the event of some kind of court settlement. And then because we're operating in the UK under the UK jurisdiction task force rules, if these physical assets are being used as the collateral in these deals are turned into NFTs on chain, in the process of the arbitration court can generate essentially a court order that causes the transfer of the assets on chain using essentially backdoors in the smart contracts. So you start the system with here's an insurance policy, or here's a house or some other piece of collateral that is accessible in the event of a court order from the arbitration courts. And then as we get more and more of that collateral as being actually physically put on chain, then at that point, those arbitration courts, rather than having to go and get a court order and apply it in the real world, can simply transfer ownership of the physical assets on chain by moving the NFTs. And it's very much a bootstrapping process because you need collateral on both sides of the physical bridge. You know, you need crypto collateral here, you need physical collateral there, and both sides of it are accessible to the arbitration courts. It's quite a robust mechanism, but it does take a lot of time to build out those kind of systems and, you know, kind of get them to the point where they actually work.
We have a couple of questions from the floor. I was wondering whether you'd like to pick them up now, or you'd like to continue the conversation for a couple more minutes.
Sure. Let's see what we've got in terms of questions.
Teej, is that right for you?
Yeah, guys, whatever you want.
Okay, so the first, it's more of a comment than a question, but I guess it needs addressing. It's from David Rankin. In a decentralized system, how do you reduce the risk of a centralized management similar to a right? Crypto should remain a trustless system, says David.
So the question is around the fact that if you're onboarding assets from the real world, you are not going to benefit from the same trustlessness that crypto native collateral has. How do you deal with that disconnect? Is that correct?
I think that would be my interpretation of that.
I think there's so if you've got something like a real estate investment trust, then the trust managers are making decisions about what pieces of real estate to buy, what to sell, what to maintain, when you put a new roof on something. Like there's a management function you have to do for a lot of real world assets. If you have gold vaulted, you might want to decide that you need to get a different insurer, move it to a different vault. And if we wind up in a system where we have essentially one gigantic REIT, which has all of the assets in it, which are then being used all the way through the crypto ecosystem, obviously that entity winds up with a huge amount of negotiating power when it comes to setting terms. I think, was that the question, David?
We have a thumbs up going up, but I can't see whether that's from David or not.
All right, good enough. Yes, more or less.
He said yes, more or less. Okay.
Okay.
We've got one more.
Well, let's
sorry,
answer that one, and then Teej, any thoughts on that?
Yes. So I'm not sure I'm completely capturing it, but I think what I'll respond with will be useful to the asker nevertheless. So, I think in general, when you're dealing with onboarding assets from the real world, I think there are two vectors that make it potentially more trusted and thus more corruptible than the crypto native assets we're accustomed to. I think the first is what you're basically doing is when you bring real world assets on chain, I view it as a reledgering. You're taking an asset that already lives in an external consensus environment, basically another chain. You can think about it as living in another L1, and you have to find a way to represent that asset in your ledger. So typically that has some sort of wrapping function. And as we all know, those bridges, that tends to be where the vulnerabilities and where the corruption can be. I see it as no different. I don't think I have to go too much deeper on that. It might in fact be more trusted than simply, wrapping BTC and putting it on Ethereum. I think the other piece, which has been, interesting for me to explore at Maker is I think in general, the crypto community is of course very, very smart, but they tend to think about things from first principles and think that if they only use first principles, they can figure out anything, which is a great attitude. But some of us have spent our careers trying to understand structured credit. It is an extremely complex endeavor for so many reasons. And so I think by virtue of that, when you're bringing these things on chain, there are going to be a handful of people that understand or think we understand the essence of how to deal with these assets, to account for their risk, to structure, to negotiate. And by virtue of that sort of rarefied knowledge, you're going to have a situation where it's a privileged few who are really kind of dictating the thought about underwriting these assets. And so this sort of, what shall I call it? This ideal or this utopia of a decentralized set of token holders, underwriting collateral actively is nice, but it's unrealistic, right? And so the question is, how do you bridge that gap whereby you use sort of domain experts to convey the risk of an asset to the token holders, but ultimately token holders are in the end responsible for actually onboarding collateral. I would say that it's absolutely something we're working with. And I think the interim before we get to this truly deterministic world where all assets live on chain, this is an issue we'll have to deal with.
Sure. And this gets into kind of two categories, right? So there's category one, which is essentially title risk. Do you own the stuff you think you own? Then the second problem is condition report. So for us, the kind of two poles of this are real estate and gold. So gold, the condition reporting is very, very simple for gold, but ensuring that there's no title risk is a little more complex because gold is often owned in many, many, many layers of paper. And getting back down to actual clean title on a bar of gold is, sometimes a little more complicated than it ought to be. On the other hand, real estate title is pretty easy to ascertain because you can look at land registers and registers of interests. But the problem in real estate is condition reporting. How do you know if it has rising damp or a flooded basement or something else along these kind of lines? And I think in both of these instances, you require different solutions because the shape of the risk is very different in those instances. We are chasing this concept right now, which we call GoldFi, which is we think there's an opportunity to basically reboot the DeFi ecosystem using decentralized provision of 400-ounce gold bars. So 20, 30, 40, 50 providers of bars, vaulting 30 jurisdictions, actually decentralized provision of gold into those pools. And as long as all the bars are good delivery bars, properly set up inside of the good delivery framework, that gives you this ability to use very, very well controlled collateral. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for that because the carrying capacity for gold as a collateral asset is enormous. And in an environment where we've got 12% US inflation, the fight towards hard assets from the dollar economy is going to be enormous. It's not just crypto people that need collateral. Ordinary American taxpayers have to get the heck out of the door before they lose 12% of their value a year. And that creates an enormous acceleration of the DeFi architecture because it means that people really need to get out of the door denominated world before the thing eats their savings.
We've got a couple more questions from the floor. I think one of them we should save for the art and collectibles panel, but there is one more which Ketan had answered, but I think it's relevant. So it's a question from Philip, and the question is: if NFTs representing real-world asset ownership are traded, can anyone from any jurisdiction buy and sell these NFTs?
Great question.
Good question, right?
So, I mean, from our perspective, the answer to that is it depends. So our take on this is, Mattereum, generally speaking, uses OpenSea for the buying and selling of assets, right? And so we say, hey, if OpenSea is willing to do business with whoever this is, that's good enough for us. I think that was okay as a starting position. In the long run, if you start talking about having very serious financial infrastructure in these kind of settings, in all probability, you are not going to be able to sell an NFT that ties to a physical asset to somebody that lives in a jurisdiction that's currently under sanctions and not face problems. And that, I think, is a generic issue for the entire industry. Sanctions enforcement is something that governments are not going to ignore. And if you begin to build successful real-world asset systems, and they're being used for sanctions busting, without any shadow of a doubt, financial regulators will arrive with axes. So I think inevitably we're going to wind up with some kind of ecosystem where it is possible to ascertain the jurisdiction of somebody buying an asset, and then we get back to the zero knowledge proof stuff that Teej was talking about, where you make sure that you don't leak identity at the same time as you verify jurisdiction. That would be my answer. Teej?
I think that's very complete, and I tend to agree. I mean, I also think, I think for stuff that's strictly financial in nature, in other words, it looks, smells like a security or has a yield attached, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you're going to need to comply with whatever regulatory architecture has been built there. What I will say, though, is a space that I'm fascinated in, and I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg here, is to what extent NFTs unlock non-strictly financial assets. In other words, what sort of assets can you bring on chain, like, IP, I suppose, or access or utility NFTs that give one access to, an artist, or access to a space.
You rent a hotel room by buying an NFT for those nights in the hotel.
Exactly. And in a situation like that, or a ticket, right? A ticket to a sports event. I mean, I can very much see the NFT space in terms of how it has to comply with sanctions and how permissionless the buyer pool can be. Very much bifurcating, right?
God, I have this conversation. I'm on the Bermuda FinTech Advisory Board, and in that context, we've had this conversation about digital chattel, right? We got digital assets; they're run like financial regulation. What about digital chattel? If my 5-year-old draws something, not that I have a 5-year-old, but if I had a 5-year-old, and they draw something in crayon, and I take a picture of that and turn it into an NFT, how did this thing magically become something that is regulated by a financial regulator? Makes no sense. And that bifurcation that you're talking about, I mean, it's exactly this thing of like, can we have digital chattel, or is everything a financial instrument?
I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious that we've got a couple more topics to cover, and we've gone slightly over time. But I was wondering, Vinay, Teej, did you have any concluding thoughts on what you had covered just now, and then we can come back to all of these topics in the Q&A.
I've got nothing. I'll give parting words to Vinay, because he actually knows what he's talking about.
Well, you're the one actually out there doing it. I mean, on this stuff, the line that we're all walking on this is like, if we replicate too much of the existing financial system, we're going to wind up with this national balkanization. Oh, people in Lebanon or Syria cannot use any of these systems, and we wind up with something which will gradually become as encumbered as what we've got right now. Whereas what we kind of need is globalization of finance, so that we've got globalization of liquidity, which might protect us from future financial collapses. And I think that there's a good kind of world peace argument to be made that if you have a genuinely global trading environment where anybody can pay anybody and you can transfer goods across borders smoothly and easily, I think in the long run, it's an investment in world peace. because where you have these balkanizations of trade and balkanizations into different regions for payments, eventually those fault lines become increasingly cultural and political, and people begin to arm, and you kind of get the traditional European meltdown. And we need a global financial regulation, because this is also how we get things like climate finance sorted out. So, at the same time as we have to comply with the law, the long-term vision, I think, ought to be towards a kind of one planet market, specifically because of the dividends in terms of both world peace and climate regulation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Teej. Thank you, Vinay. I've got a couple more topics to cover, but I propose we take a 5-minute break, comfort break, so folks can go and get a drink, a cup of tea or a glass of water, and then we come back here in 5 minutes and move on to the next topic.
Fabulous. I hope you're all enjoying the event, and thank you very much for your questions, and thank you to all the panelists we've talked to so far. Teej, thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much, guys. It was an absolute pleasure. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Teej. I hope everybody had a good break, and according to the schedule, we are going to discuss art and collectibles next. Now, in Mattereum, we have this concept of the $4 million quartet of asset classes where assets can be valued at $1 million or more. And one of these asset classes clearly is art and collectibles, where you get artworks and other items which can be valued at over $1 million. So we are very fortunate to have a wonderful panel here. We've got Maryna from Artstead, we've got Griff from 4K, and we've got Ian Simmons from Mattereum. So I'm going to start, as with the previous panel, each one of our panelists to spend about a minute or so telling us about themselves, their background, and their work, and then we will move into the discussion, if that's okay with everybody. So perhaps we can start with Maryna.
Hey everyone, and great panel so far. I really enjoyed the previous speakers. My name is Maryna. I represent artstead.com, and we are an online marketplace that initially was envisioned as a Web2 company, and still is in a way Web2 company, where artists from all over the world could sell, buy, trade original, unique artwork. And just recently, as of January this year, we've moved into Web3 by adopting some of the NFT features and offering this technology to our user base, which we like to call the real artists, since they have come from a traditional background with working with traditional media and having that kind of track record, which many digital artists or digitally native artists may not have. So that is our unique take on the NFTs, and I'm really excited to share some of the visions and learn about you guys' progress and innovation.
Thank you very much, Maryna. Griff, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Anton, for introducing us all and for putting on this event. It's been truly a fascinating panel so far, and glad to have so many great speakers here and to play a small part in it. So I lead business development at 4K.com, and 4K really started as the first physically backed marketplace to really interchange with luxury assets, whether watches, Casasius coins, in a Web3 native way, just using your MetaMask. And what really rings true that came up in the earlier conversations is, to what extent is this centralized? How do you really grade a physical asset and bring that on chain? And what 4K has done so far is we have ensured physical and vaulted custody of these real world assets. However, what the protocol is building in the future is really the infrastructure to support other brands, guardians, and different types of people who want to interact with physically backed NFTs, launch them, and bring them on chain. So what we're thinking about is items like storage fees and how to really bridge these worlds together, in addition to kind of having the marketplace be that primary feature set that you can always redeem and get the physical asset at any time.
Thank you very much, Griff. And now we come to Ian Simmons. Ian, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your own work with Mattereum.
Hi, yes. I'm Ian Simmons, and I'm one of the ontology team at Mattereum. The ontology team is the people who do the key part of the process of documenting the assets and creating the asset passports that bring together the warranties and the detailed description of the thing that we're putting on the chain and connects them to the NFT. My background is as a museum curator, so I've got lots of experience in examining and documenting historic objects, and that's what I'm bringing to bear on the asset passports for Mattereum, along with my other colleagues in the department who are all either museum curators or archivists.
Thank you very much, Ian. So we already have a question in the chat, but perhaps I can start by asking a question as well. So we've been talking about bridging the divide between physical and digital. So my question to all panelists is, what are some of the bigger challenges in bridging this divide perhaps from your own perspective? Maryna, perhaps we can start with you.
Yeah, that is a great question. Well, I see two main challenges that we've personally encountered as a company. First of all, being, as I mentioned, onboarding the users that have not come in contact with blockchain technology or NFT tools before, and educating the community to make use of this new technology, incorporating it in their practice. That was a challenge. However, we received great feedback, and it was a very productive flow to follow with. And the second challenge that we've encountered was that of bringing the digitally native artwork in form of NFTs to be exhibited in physical settings in real world. So of course, if NFTs are meant to exist on digital ledgers and on cloud and internet as IPFS files. However, it's the community that sort of enables the fruition and brings about a different type of utility. So exhibiting the actual digital work and finding new ways to do it in an ever more engaging way, and in the ways that make sense for both the creator and the observer, that has been a great challenge that we still don't have a definite answer to, and it's all work in progress.
Thank you, Maryna. Griff, same question to you. What do you see as the bigger challenges in bridging the physical and the digital?
Yeah, it's a great question. I definitely resonate with everything Maryna said. I'll just kind of expand from 4K in my personal perspective, what I've seen from working in this space. There's really two areas I'd highlight. The first is the crypto native divide with other brands, Web2, the traditional world, which is that, of course, you have to build your protocol to certain standards, whether that's metadata for the NFTs, whether it's regulation, whether it's which blockchain you're building on, and whether it's the onboarding process and education, or kind of a mismatch in what the technology can do today and what brands and other people are trying to do with real world assets on chain, because it's such a holy grail for blockchain and people are so excited by it. But there's really the baby steps of what you need to do to kind of have a cohesive strategy and start experimenting with bridging the two worlds. And that's kind of what we find is one of the continual challenges and also exciting aspects of working in this space. And then to kind of echo and piggyback on some of the earlier discussion, that regulatory uncertainty as well, especially internationally, whether it's sanctions, if you're building a Web3 protocol but have to geofence it for certain areas, that requires a ton of compliance time when you're a startup, and that isn't really the main focus, but you have to make sure you're building it to be capable of that.
Thank you very much. And Ian, I know you've obviously been working hands-on on bridging the physical and the digital. What have some of the challenges been, or what are some of the challenges from your perspective on that?
I think that ones I've come across, key one is getting the client whose asset we're documenting to understand the granular level of the information that we need to capture in order to embody the asset that they're talking about in the asset passport, because it really needs to be really clear so that it cannot be mistaken for any other asset. And the other challenge that there is for sort of things like artworks and the variety of historic objects and related things that we've brought on board, is that each one is bespoke. Fortunately, with the ontology team, the asset passports can be adapted and worked on in concert with the owners of the assets to create the bespoke asset passport, which enables us to truly express the nature of the object and to connect it to appropriate warranties, so that when we're when they've got the connected to the NFT and it's on the chain, that the right things are expressed through those to enable the warranties to function in the way that they should. And we work very closely with clients to make that happen. But it's always a challenge to actually get the focus right and bring all those things together.
Thank you very much, Ian. So we have a question from the floor, which has been put into the Q&A box. And it's a question from Joe Mangrum. And the question is, as an artist, I am curious how the process would work for unsold artworks in my possession. In the studio, the ability to continue exhibitions until the artwork is sold. How transfers would then proceed if someone purchased the NFT? I guess we can do this in reverse order. If Griff, perhaps we can start with you. Do you have any views or comments on Joe's question?
I think that's an amazing question, and I'd start off by saying I think there's a couple different philosophical frameworks that everyone, even the panelists here, are kind of starting in terms of how that physically backed NFT is really going to interact with the real world and how it will enable artists and physical art that might be different than wine collectibles, for instance, which you need provenance and proof of custody throughout the time period to really ensure its value. So one thing I think about for artists and galleries specifically is how NFTs enable a new form of ownership and lending, where, say, I have this artwork which is a Raymond Pettibon that's on my wall. Could I actually display it at a gallery, have the NFT of that, and really, do I get more of a admiration for having that in the gallery at a certain time and redeeming the NFT to then get the physical artwork back? That's kind of the philosophy of how 4K has built out our protocol initially, is that you won't be having the NFT as well as the physical artwork or physical item at the same time, and there's a burn mechanism involved. However, I think a lot of different, I think there's just different approaches to how you can consider that based on the target market and audience for that specific item. And artists are just being enabled in a couple new innovative ways through NFTs, which is the really exciting part underlying it all.
Thank you very much, Griff. Ian, we come to you again. So this is very much a question about the philosophy of how you approach this idea of ownership while still displaying the artworks, or whilst the artworks are still in the artist's possession.
I mean, there's two ways that through the Mattereum system that things can be traded as NFTs when from original artworks. There's the way that it can be done by asset passporting it, vaulting the artwork and selling the NFT as an NFT, and the artwork stays in the same place. And the other way is to have unique identifiers in terms of tags or scans of the thing, which give it its immutable identity, that they become part of the asset passport that is then goes with the object wherever it's sold. So if it's physically there, you've got the details on the asset passport that can be used to completely verify its existence. And one of the great advantages of this is that if you start in the artist's studio and go forward, you have the provenance on the blockchain all the way through. So everything about the thing is there every time it's sold throughout its entire existence, so that there's absolutely no need for galleries, purchases and so on to have to trek back through the provenance and prove it for themselves again, because it's there and backed by warranties that have financial consequences if they are in error.
Thank you very much, Ian. And again, the same question to Maryna.
Yeah, I've been actually very puzzled with this question, and it's one of the questions that I get quite a lot, especially from the artists that are just minting their first NFTs, their first digital works. Well, yeah, I agree with the other panelists that there's two ways on how to approach it. It's either you digitalize the physical work and make an NFT copy of it, and both of them coexist in a synergy, or you either, if either one of them is sold, and Damien Hirst kind of illustrated in a very nice way last year by creating this collection of works that if one of them was to be kept, then it's either the digital or physical version was to be destroyed or burned. So it's either you go with that, or as Ian mentioned, you go the way of tagging the original physical piece with something that then marks it and that then bridges it to the token, and you sort of have the token represent the physical original. But either way you choose to go with, I think they're both great applications of this technology. It only depends on your work, on what you want to achieve with your studio practice, and on your general vision as an artist.
Thank you very much, Maryna. So I think that was a really good question. I think that concludes this panel on this specific subject. But please, I hope that all the panelists will stick around for the wider Q&A and for the networking event. And I'm conscious that we have one more topic to cover of these $1 million plus sub-asset classes, and that is real estate. And we have for the next panel, for the next conversation, we have Anton Shleupanov from Trust Me Blockchain, and we've got Vinay Gupta, CEO and founder of Mattereum. We did have another panelist, but unfortunately he has dropped off, who is working on a piece of real estate specifically in England. But perhaps Vinay can touch on that work. So again, as before, perhaps our two panelists can introduce themselves. I know Vinay has already previously introduced himself, but perhaps repeat some of the introduction and tell us a little bit about what they're working on in the space of real estate or implications for real estate. So Anthony, perhaps you could start.
Yeah, thanks, Anton. Vinny, good to catch up with you again.
Hey, good to see you.
Enjoyed the previous speakers. Good fun. Yeah, so I'm the CEO, one of the founders of the TPX property exchanges. And we've been working since early 17 with the FCA, Bank of England, Treasury, HMLR, HMRC, Bank of Canada a little bit more recently, to create property titles as a liquid tradable asset class on public regulated exchanges. And so we're working very hard on that. Vinny gave me some good pointers in the early years about adjudication on the chain, and to make sure that we've got an institutional grade asset that the institutions can buy and sell on the chains that we've created for this. So we've been doing this for about 5 years. We're about to launch the first of 20 exchanges in London over the next few months and weeks and months now. Days, it feels like. So it's certainly gathering a pace. And we have launch teams set up in a number of different cities to launch their exchanges. So we should be, after we launch London, we should be announcing a new exchange every 6 to 8 weeks or so.
That's amazing. That's phenomenal.
Amazing, indeed. Thank you very much. Vinay, would you like to reintroduce yourself and say a little bit about what Mattereum is doing in the real estate space?
Sure. So Vinay Gupta, CEO of Mattereum. This is our 5th year of operations, and we are just in the middle of doing the first of the real estate transactions. Lots and lots and lots of interesting sort of problems to solve during real estate, as I'm sure you found. And what we are basically focused on for real estate is less the title transfer. We think title transfer is something that's going to have to be done jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and we can set it up for jurisdictions. We know how to do it. We think the large and hairy problem is actually condition reporting for the real estate, because the incentives in the blockchain space, because the payments are being made in crypto and they're generally non-repudiatable, is for people to attempt real estate fraud, where they will lie about things like the building has drive rot, list the assets for sale, and then run off with the crypto, throw it through a washer, and then they're out the other side, a mixer. So for us, the focus has very much been on, like, how do you get the liability framework around each piece of real estate to be as close to airtight as possible, so that when somebody buys a piece of real estate using whatever the underlying rail is to actually arrange the transfer of title, the real estate that they receive is exactly what they were expecting to receive, or there are recoverable assets that can be seized to back up the gap left for remediation.
Yeah, and this is a fascinating subject, which I'm sure, Vinny, you and I could spend weeks discussing, as we did.
Oh yeah.
We took a top-down regulated approach to it from day one. So the way that we were working to do this, and this is useful, was to precisely mirror existing workflow processes and practices. So if you want to work with the system and enable it, you shouldn't try to change the rules by which it operates. You look to and seek to enhance those rules. And so from our point of view, we very much focused on the search, the survey. How do you list a property on a public regulated exchange? How do you make sure you have verification, validation? How do you make sure the usual suspects don't get up to the usual things? Because I haven't yet met someone who wants to sell a property that didn't want to enhance its value in one form or another by misrepresenting it in any way that they possibly can. So there are aspects of this which you have to be very, very aware of. Property is also a different asset. It has aspects of geolocation associated with it. So when you've created a digital asset of a property and you have that on a public exchange, well, it will come as no great surprise to many that your neighbors will try to talk up or bid up your price. Because it will directly affect their own properties. In common parlance in exchange language, that's called front running. And like any public regulated exchange, it's not allowed. So inevitably, you can see already, if you compare some of the practices that the crypto trading environment uses and try to envisage that on the types of exchange that we're looking at, which is an asset-based exchange, then you have a different policing function. And some of these policing functions have to be new, because they're not as much of a feature on an equity exchange as they are on a property exchange. The surveillance package is different. The oversight is different. The geolocation as a fundamental requirement is different. So all of these come into play. But our fundamental mission is exactly the same as Vinny's, and that is to make property a liquid tradable asset class for all. And we take a very strong view, and we're largely macroeconomic guys, and we've taken a 200-year view on how property works within our economy. But what's different about us is we have no hypothecation, no bailment. There are no liens or charges in any of our assets ever in the way that we've constructed them. It's a linear process.
Tell me a little more about that. That's a real breakthrough.
Well, what's the real breakthrough is, and this will be quite a shock to many probably listening, is we realize very quickly that the volumes that you achieve on an exchange are minuscule, quite honestly, in a crypto exchange, in the nature of the real world of the volume marketplace.
Yeah.
So we set out from day one to make sure that our units of asset, as we created them, using AMMs and Uniswaps, have real-time liquidity in a real-world environment. Our model is very much that you can take a property on, say, one of our exchanges in Singapore, as an example, and you can buy a cup of coffee in London at Starbucks in real time, without having to go and transfer that through the banks. So millisecond sort of transfer, and then transfer of title of asset. Have that verified, validated at all stages in the process, utterly transparent.
So you have the payment rail and the title rail on the same software platform.
Yeah, we're driving the utility value of the asset. From our model, it's this: is in a high inflation environment, property is an inflation-resistant asset by and large.
Oh yeah.
And you can see the net inflows going into the asset class at the moment. And Bill Gates is now the U.S.'s biggest property owner, et cetera, et cetera. Blackstone also.
And I think it's worth noting this for the audience. Like, I mean, we didn't see a 12% U.S. inflation rate since the 1970s, maybe. You know, so there's never been a point where Americans, you know, who are under 50 really have seen this situation where every year the stuff in your bank account is worth 10% less. You just can't buy as much stuff for the same amount of money. And so that tends to cause a flight out of cash and into hard assets like real estate and gold, because otherwise you're just sitting there losing money very rapidly.
Yes, and we again, we're fundamentalists in many ways in this space. So what we realized, we worked with some of the central banks and some of the supervisory boards of central banks back in 16 and 17, and we did some modeling around this. And we looked at the fiscal and monetary tools that they were able to deploy in a high debt scenario. And they were clear. Their tools no longer are effective. And they gave us, I won't scare everybody on this call, some very, very finite timelines by which they thought the current system in its fiscal and monetary tools could continue to operate in the way that it does. So we're at a transition point. Now, this has happened many times over the last 200 years. This is not the first time. You know, our fiat is being debased, and people are reaching out and trying to find a currency that they can trust. And many of the fiat currencies are currently failing. This is perfect for us in the digital asset world, because this is where naturally people will go if but only we as an industry can make sure that we have the processes, the systems, the oversight, transparency, governance that's needed here.
This is very much the stuff that Teej was talking about earlier on, that, you know, Maker's vision is very much like you just pile as much collateral into their system as possible and then issue money directly against it.
Yeah, but the issue I have with that a little bit, and as always being somewhat a rebel in this, is most people are looking at this as an extension of the existing financial system or the trading systems, whereas we're looking at it from an asset-based economy point of view.
Right, which I think is where Maker is coming from. I mean, Maker are very much of the perspective that they're going to basically issue money against hard assets rather.
Yes, but they're looking at then having created that inside an instrument, that instrument then being leveraged. And that margin accounts and trading accounts.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's in many ways an inherent danger in an asset-based economy, because then we're repeating the past.
Oh yeah, I mean, hard assets plus leverage, you know, you're always going to wind up with drama for sure.
Yeah, we have no margin accounts in our system. We have no leverage.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And that's key to us, because we don't want to take the systemic risks of the old system and inherit it and revisit it to the new.
Okay.
But what is different is
that's very innovative indeed.
Well, if you take an asset-based system and you say the core of every payment is you're paying at an asset, and if I was to turn around to Vinny or anyone else on this call,
wait, so when you say paying at an asset, you literally mean like you're going to pay me with a chunk of real estate? Like
I'm going to pay you with a small
percent of an apartment in New York. Please put a new roof on my house.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. So
now the thing is that you have to have the verification, validation, valuation processes, systems running in real time behind that.
Sure.
So if you have a real time AMM backing up your asset for each and individual property.
I actually have a proposal sitting with the government that I can't name for enabling the trading of equity and REITs as payment instruments.
Yeah, and that's a halfway house to where we are.
It's exactly that, right? It's a quick and dirty way of getting people to be able to pay each other with real estate. So, Anton, you had a question a second ago.
Yeah, well, so I was going to say an observation. Teej has come back on the stage, so if you would like him to comment on some of what you've been saying, he could do that. I hope. But there is also a question in the chat from David, same question as before, which is for specifically on real estate. In a decentralized system, how do you reduce the risk of centralized management similar to a REIT?
Okay. Might be able to help there.
Reintroduce yourself for anybody that hasn't seen you before. Welcome back.
Okay, this is inevitably our view.
So give Teej a chance to reintroduce himself because we may have some new people joined from earlier.
Hi guys, I was on before. My name is Teej Ragsdale or Teej. It's good to be here. I am on the real world finance team at MakerDAO. The team basically seeks to onboard structured credit assets from the real world into the collateral base for the stablecoin DAI, which is pegged to the US dollar. It's good to be here.
Fabulous. Great. Thank you. All right. Anthony, back to you.
Yeah. So when we're looking at this issue, the key thing is maintaining, if I've answered this question correctly, is maintaining, again, it's not a share of a REIT, it's not a share of a company that owns a property. It is the title of certificate itself recognized by governments, HMLR, land registries, deed offices, and under securities law. So from that point of view, we very carefully crafted it to make sure that it maintains its sanctity throughout the system. And therefore, there's no margin accounts on it. There's no leverage on the asset. Each time it trades on the exchanges ensure that it has no lien, charge, or liability associated with it. It trades absolutely clean. And one of the things we realized...
are you getting that effect by holding the title?
Partially, yes.
This kind of lien-free property is a very hard thing to arrange. We took a long look at that, and it was nasty. A lot of jurisdictions just don't have the mechanisms for doing it.
Yeah, and we very carefully self-contained it within the location of each of our TPX exchanges. So, for example, we have local adjudication on the chain. We're totally consistent with the local rules. Our mining is a fully DeFi model. The mining is all done within the local jurisdiction of that exchange. Sure. So they can get at the infrastructure, they can get at the systems, the servers, the gateways, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then we're, as always, we sat down.
But I want to go back to this kind of technocratic point. So you have title, right? So to ensure that nobody takes out a lien on a piece of property, you know, in a lot of jurisdictions, you don't have a register of interests where you can put the lien into a kind of public visible form.
We do.
How do you strip the liens off if somebody comes with an encumbered thing, how do you detect the encumbrance on the way into the system?
Yeah, absolutely. Each of our certificates is enumerated, even down to the smallest sizes. And we run a transparent asset registry for that. So when we're dealing with land registries and deed offices, we set up something called the blockchain property registry. We operate in parallel to them. We give them the keys. We give the tax guys.
So you have state cooperation in establishing what amounts to a register of interest. So you're partnered with the governments to get these registers up and running.
Well, not necessarily, because what we realized very quickly is a lot of the land registries are desperate to get a better registry.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and they lack the resources for it. So we don't take on any of their responsibilities. They have their acts of parliament which define their activities. But I stress to add here a couple of points. One, a third of the properties in the United Kingdom is never being registered on our land registry here. There's no legal requirement for it to be registered, and that exists under law. The other piece of that is fully 2/3 of the property in the United Kingdom has no lien, charges, or liabilities on it at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
And part of what's driving this entire process is the requirement of national economies to find a better way to monetize their assets in a high inflation environment and drive tax receipts.
Absolutely. And I mean, all of this kind of stuff, right? I mean, you know, our experience with this is that the devil is always in the detail. You know, being able to figure out how to detect these encumbrances and how to detect problems like, hey, the building has dry rot or something, like it's the management of those conditions of exception that becomes the heart of building a system that has like durable integrity.
I mean, the challenge was for us is to work out the economic, because we do original search and survey on every property listed. You know, it's exactly like the IPO process you'd expect for a public company. All right, and there's reporting requirements. There's insurance. We monitor the insurance. We monitor the properties. We audit the process. we verify the assets at each stage throughout.
So the risk absorption in this, you mentioned insurance. So you have something with title, you have somebody that asserts that the title is clean, you then have insurance in the loop. So if they've made a mistake, there's somebody there to catch it.
There's title insurance, there's hazard insurance, there's insurance for the asset on the exchange.
Teej, this is, the kind of gory horror of the physical real estate business. I mean, I can see why Maker prefers things like nicely tidied up fixed income revenue streams.
Yeah.
Talk to us a wee bit here about, how does Maker think about real estate, basically, right? Because everybody, I think, is looking at real estate like, here's the mood and we'd like to put it on a stick. What's the kind of Maker perspective on real estate as sort of the ultimate asset class?
I mean, I think in a sense, real estate is, it sort of is the holy grail of on-chain securitization, but it's also like the first, it's like an elementary obsession as well. When people think about what tokenizing assets look like, the first thing that comes to mind is real estate. And I think that's because it's so understandable and people think about it as a wealth generating asset that's consistent. It's provided yield over time. People that are familiar with sort of securitization concepts, whether it's CMBS or RMBS. The way we look at real estate is, it is part of a broader portfolio of credit assets that make DAI more resilient. What we don't like about real estate at all is if we want to onboard real estate, which we have and will continue to in the near term, it's very much just shoehorning DeFi into existing traditional structures. So for our recent deal with Huntington Valley Bank or even Societe Generale, we're leaning on traditional structures. We're making sure that, Maker token holders have the rights and remedies in the real world that any lender would benefit from. So we think, we'll continue to build out the, RWA protocol, if you will, to start to bring more of those aspects around rights and remedies for real estate on chain. But I think just naturally, the asset class, by virtue of really living in, municipal ledgers and being, so inextricably corporeal, it's meat and potatoes, it's atoms. It's just hard, right? And so until we get to the stage, 10, 15 years out where everything is deterministic and beautiful and, trading a token on chain is not recognized only by Swiss law as entitling the owner to the underlying asset, but all jurisdictions, this is kind of the middle ground we're left with.
Yeah, and it's quite swampy. We've extended into gold relatively enthusiastically, and real estate is a very, very tentative one step at a time process because the complexity is enormous. I remember a couple of years ago talking to some folks from the Netherlands Land Registry, and in the Netherlands, the Geospatial Intelligence Agency, like their equivalent of Ordnance Survey, is fused into the Land Registry. It's a single body. And they had gone through and taken every single patch of land, like every square meter of the Netherlands, and they'd figured out exactly who owned it and how it was owned and what the deeds and the rights and so on were, right back to scanning 800-year-old goat hide parchment deeds in Old Dutch. They had a rough translation of what it said. They put that stuff into the Land Registry and they said, if you ever need to litigate on this, here is a scan of the parchment. And then the original parchments were put into kind of deep storage. And the fact that you might wind up having to go back 800 years and get an Old Dutch certified translation for modern court before you can handle a property dispute in the Netherlands. Like, I've never forgotten that as like, there is a kind of relatively simple end to real estate, and then there is a relatively hard end to real estate. And, we very specifically steer towards the easy end of that spectrum because the hard end is unthinkably difficult.
I have to come back on that one, Vinny. When we looked at Italy has some very good property law, but it still takes some 19 years to settle a property case. And India, I'm afraid, takes 30 years. So, as much as the laws might be good, is the
Greece, right? Greece has informal titling where you think you bought a patch of land and then 5 people tell you that it actually belongs to somebody else because they misdeclared it for tax reasons 3 generations ago, and everybody honors that because the ledger is held socially.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a slippery business. And, I remember talking to Hernando de Soto about this stuff. This was at a Satoshi roundtable back in the day. And De Soto is the guy who basically, everybody thinks of De Soto as being kind of a left-wing leader, he champions the rights of the working people and they have their land plots in these peasant economies and they get land title and all the rest of it. And De Soto is actually a hard right ultra-capitalist who basically says, look, the only way that you could prevent peasant revolutions is by giving the peasants access to the court system. And they don't get access to the court system without titles. If you don't give them access to the machinery of capitalism, they become Marxist and then they blow up your bridges. Had you considered? And De Soto was very proud of the fact that he'd prevented a bunch of peasant insurgencies by going out there and getting people access to courts. So that is the politicization of land. Is not greatly seen in the cities of the developed world, but you get out to the periphery and even the concept that the land is ownable becomes questionable as you get out into, say, the jungles of India, where the Naxalites are of the opinion that the land is not something that has title. Just sort of wax philosophical there, but
no.
A deep area, isn't it?
Well, it's fundamental. The ownership of the asset, we think, is critical. Particularly when you have an enormous aggregation of wealth between the asset owning and the non-asset owning. So access to the asset in the first place, we think, is absolutely critical for future social harmony. And if you can create exchanges where someone can buy a slice of a property and share in the ownership of that, and use that as a form of direct money, direct exchange, that holds value. That's enormously valuable.
Having the ability to do essentially transactions that would be Forex transactions, but instead to use swaps of real equity and real estate.
Exactly.
If you're Fujitsu and IBM, and we've both got offices in New York, and as we pay each other for goods and services, we're just exchanging equity in our buildings. As long as you don't wind up with horrible complexity and tax, it keeps you out of the inflationary economy, and it means that contracts can be priced in something which is long-term theoretically stable.
Yeah, they're interesting pieces on the tax side, which we're working on with governments. One of the key things is as each exchange launches, we actually enable that any property taxes that are due get paid before the asset is moved. Capital gains down, the usual rules. And what we've seen already is there's a huge value in that because in the UK, for example, your stamp duty is at a threshold where most of these transactions will go through without attracting stamp duty, which is very good for the UK economy as a whole because it will enable more property to be moved. The other aspect is in the US, you have capital gains rollover. So if you buy a property, sell it, and then use those proceeds to buy another property within 3 months, you have no capital gains to pay on that, which is how Mr. Trump managed to amass his wealth. And these sort of things they're different in different jurisdictions, and you have to build each exchange to keep the tax code in place.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And that kind of jurisdiction stuff is hard work. Well done for getting through that.
Yeah, easy.
Anthony, is the premise that regulators should come around to the idea of the 1031 being applicable even when the whole is fractionalized?
It's a good question. We've been dealing with that. I mean, we try to maintain ourselves as platform operators, as exchange operators. Tax code down to the parties. We tell them what's possible, even to the point of micro taxation of assets transferring in other countries, in theory. And that's very interesting to them because it effectively allows them to look at tax differently, more on a consumption taxation level, which is easier to collect and calls, it's lower cost for them. So these are some of the things that are in their minds as we go. Our job is to enforce current taxation levels. To be perfectly clear, when we work with the local regulators, we work with the local tax authorities, it's to mirror what they've already done. But some of the points that we've had with the FCA on these, without necessarily saying too much of what they're saying, is there certain things that they can tax, and there's certain things that it's impossible for them to ever tax. And they're acknowledging that, and they're trying to deal with it. They're having a few cases of indigestion over there, but they're getting there.
I'm conscious of the time, and Dom has just reminded me that we only have a few minutes left to go, and we did promise a wider Q&A. So, could I please invite all of the panelists who have already been on the stage unmute or to prepare to answer questions. And if there are questions for them, may I invite all participants to ask questions of all or any panelists. If there aren't questions for all panelists, we can continue talking, of course, about real estate. I see that Kate had a question about real estate, about tokenized apartments. Perhaps I could invite her to speak and to ask that question with her voice. I can see that there are a few other comments and questions in the chat. So, I mean, this is an informal setting, so it's up to us how we go. But if there are questions for all of the panelists, please do ask them. If not, perhaps Kate, I could invite you to speak and to ask your question about real estate. Would that be okay? I can see that I think, Kate, you're logged in from more than one device, so I'll invite you your first device and see if you're able to ask your question. No, that might be muted.
Okay, Kate, any Kate. So thank you very much for being on the panels today. It's been really good to get kind of cross-section of views on sort of, real world assets, real estate, the physicality. Really good to see the diversity of opinion from the stuff that you can bring to the stuff that you live in to the stuff that you spend. Do we have some questions lined up? Should we do this thing?
Oh, well, we got another question about real estate in the Q&A dialogue, which we could look at, or we could move on to the after party discussion.
Well, does anybody actually come on stage and ask their questions? We could do that.
Come on, someone hop up there.
Yeah, do it.
I'm dying to know what David Rankins looks like because he asked the best question so far.
Hey.
Those are good questions, actually.
Great. Invite David up and see if he wants to come up. Tell us a little what's on his mind.
Dom, are you able to give David the ability to speak?
David,
there we are, David. David, you're on the stage. You have the floor if you wanted to say your question out loud.
No, all good. It's just mostly comments, right? No, I got into this space early into the metaverse section. I came from a real estate background, having a broker's license, but in being in construction and real estate, but got into the metaverse applications because I saw the ability to having title on chain, right? At the time in 2020, I was looking at a foreclosure and I had called because it was a small little town, and the guy in the title company said, yeah, it'll take about 2 weeks to get you information on that for title. And I'm like, 2 weeks? At the same time, I was looking at metaverse property and looking at the fact that I could look at the full transaction history on title, on chain, to see all the transactions of who bought and sold and when it was purchased and all this stuff. And was like, this would be absolutely brilliant and wonderful if we had all of our title in real estate, this way. And so that kind of brought me into the whole space, and has made me very interested in the fact that, maybe one day we may be able to do this same thing with mortgages. There's platforms out there that let you borrow at 0.5% against your Ethereum with no interest, right? And so when you start seeing things like that, and you're like, wow, there's definitely some financial innovation that can be done in this space, that if we can find a way to put title and real estate on this, unfortunately, it's going to be a long time to get governments onboarded in this process, right? But once we can get that, I see a lot of benefit. But there obviously does come risk with that, such as if you're in possession of your own property, what happens if you lose your seed phrase, which was your title to your property, and other various things. So it's always very fascinating.
That one we have pretty good control over, right? Because of the way that we do this kind of legal binding and all the stuff involving arbitration contracts, recording contracts, it gives us pretty good contingency management in the event that somebody loses their keys. It's one of the things where we think that failing over to regular litigation is a good way of handling key loss, because it discourages people from losing their keys. It makes clear that losing your keys is a disaster. But in the event that it happens, there is a mechanism where you can go to a court and they can actually restore the link between your physical property and a new key in a kind of override context.
So, but does it rely on a corporation?
Well, it relies on a court, right?
On a court.
Yeah.
Okay. So if there's a court system that's integrated with it, then I could see that. The problem, I played in DeFi now for 2 years. And people always say, "Oh, they're concerns of hacks and exploits," and there are. It's fair. It's a beta system, in my opinion, and we're basically testing new financial systems. But the thing is then I go look at people who've been playing in CeFi on something like Voyager or Celsius, who now have hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars trapped in a system that was a trusted system, trusting some entity. And the whole purpose that I see in the benefit of DeFi is the fact that we, once these protocols are set, obviously we need to test these protocols, but once they are set, there's mostly a trustless system where there's no entity that we are, relying on who can walk away with our funds at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So that system is what I'm believing in the long run, and it takes time to build all this stuff, but I see the vision long term. It makes me hopeful.
We have a question from Nelson. I'm not sure whether he'd like to come on stage to ask it, or I could read it out. Perhaps I could read it out for purposes of speed. And I think that's a great question for everybody to have a go at. How do you see the tokenization of real-world assets connect with the move around refi, regenerative finance, carbon markets, and ESG? I think that's a really good question. I was wondering whether all or any panelists would like to comment on that.
I can give this one a hack. I mean, I think, ultimately the tokenization of real estate and the creation of new and better climate assets ultimately suffer from the same weakness, which is we haven't actually taken the time to address the primary Oracle problem, right? Which is you still are going to have a trusted Oracle on the real estate side, which is, a 65-year-old appraiser with a clipboard. On the climate asset side, you ultimately still have the Vera carbon process ledgering these assets, right? And both those are imprecise and are processes that could use improvement. I think until we address the primary Oracle problem, we haven't really gotten there. I think for makers' perspective,
they have an error rate, right? Like, because they're a human process, 0.5%, 1%, a third of a percent, they're always going to have a default error rate for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I would even go further on the climate side, right? Like, I assume this group is privy to the dynamics there, but it's really kind of a clown show in the background, right? I mean, these processes enrich the consultants and the lawyers, and and it's just very imprecise. It's kind of a joke, right? Until we address that piece, which I think crypto economic systems have the potential to. You haven't really unlocked like a genuine 0 to 1 or an incremental advantage against the existing system. There are protocols like Flow Carbon that are looking to bring credits on chain, right? But you're still taking the same sort of busted ledger and just representing things on chain. What I do think is interesting here is, as we've recognized with the renewables process, until the economic thing and the right thing are the same, there's no lasting change that really happens. And Maker has what is, in my view, an unprecedented opportunity to drive towards the ends we want to see in the world by combining decent oracles with a concomitant competitive cost of capital if we see the things we want to see, right? So if we can verify that, in fact, this party is, applying green efficiency standards to their building, we mint DAI against that building, and we can drop that cost of capital by 25 bips. What we can also do, and this is a little bit of a reach, but if you think about what economic incentives do to galvanize behavioral change, not only can we incentivize more sustainable activity, but we can also incentivize asset originators and asset managers to pipe more transparent data on chain. In other words, if you embed a more rigorous Oracle process such that our DAI holders can see exactly what's backing these real world assets, we can in fact give you a slightly better cost of capital. And I think that's where things start to get interesting for me.
So Vinay, I thought you said something very interesting earlier in regards to data and providing data, where you have the potential for slashing. I'm sure most of us are aware of proof of stake, right? And if somebody is malaligned and doesn't act accordingly, they get slashed, right? So I mean, I think that's a great idea. Let's say we had appraisers who were working with this system, right? And then they provided the data, and they had some stake in the network of this system that they get rewarded or they get paid through. And if they show proof that, all of a sudden that they're providing false data, their stake gets cut. And I think that would be a brilliant system.
But I mean, that's how it works, right? We've been selling, we sold our first gold on OpenSea 10 months ago with exactly that thing implemented on the legal side.
Very cool. Very cool.
We have a couple. I think we should move to the after party relatively soon. But we have got a couple more quite interesting questions, which have popped up. I think which some of the panelists might be particularly strong on. So if I can do them in reverse order, if that's okay. So the first question is from Matthew. I can't see your surname, Matthew, but the question is, how does DeFi plug into physical asset NFTs, particularly collectibles, fractionalization, leveraging, etc.? And are there any in real life IRL use cases? And perhaps we could come back to Maryna and to Griff to start with for that one, and then others can jump in as well. Who would like to go?
Sure, I will go first if you guys can still hear me.
Please do, yes.
So it is a very broad question to start with.
Sorry, you broke up there.
Fine art, any type of antiquities, anything you can think of that has some type of rarity embedded in it. In regards with art, I think the real life use cases as per fractionalization.
Sorry, Maryna, you're breaking up a little bit. Maryna, we're losing you. Perhaps we could go to Griff with that question, and then Maryna can maybe move her connection to somewhere a little bit with better reception, and then we could come back to Maryna. Griff.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. It's a really great question, Matthew. Just to speak to it, I think we're in the early innings of seeing these use cases really be built out. With 4K, we just had our first DeFi loan of an actual Rolex with Arcade. So plugging in and having that use case will be something that I think we'll just start seeing a lot more in the future, whether it's lending. I think fractionalization of physical assets, something I'm really fascinated with, are like physical asset acquisition DAOs. Of course, regulations and fractionalization, that's just one of the bigger issues where physical assets can start resembling more of securities. So there's a lot of different layers to that. For instance, that's something that we're not willing to handle internally just because of the current US regulatory frameworks. But I do think as they kind of get broadened out in scope, that will be something for in real life use cases to just continue to expand and grow.
Thank you very much, Griff. Would anybody else like to jump in on that question?
I'm going to touch on securitization briefly. So, generally speaking, if you sell an entire asset as an NFT, here's your gold brick, here's your, Modigliani print, wherever it happens to be. Generally speaking, that token will not be a security. If that token is for something like a rental apartment, it generates a revenue stream, generally that will be thought of as being a security. And when you take something like a painting and split it up to 10 parts, those parts will tend to be securities. The tricky part with all of this stuff is about minority shareholder protection. So if I own 1% of a painting and 51% of it goes to a bunch of lunatics from 8chan who decide they're going to take it out and burn it for kicks, do I have any minority investor protection that protects me from how people irresponsibly handling my assets? And that question, like if we can figure out how to solve minority investor protection in these kind of areas, that's the sort of approach that brings down the risk and brings down the risk and brings down the risk to the part where it's not inconceivable that you could see small jurisdictions start having new frameworks for securitization of physical assets, as long as the investor protection protocols are in place.
Okay, Maryna, if your connection is back, could you perhaps have another go at answering that question? or if not, we can save it for the after party. No.
Yes, apologies about my connection.
No problem.
Yes, I'll gladly take more questions, but I think the other panelists covered it extensively.
Okay, thank you very much, Maryna. So we have, I think, let's conclude on a question which I really like the sound of, and I think it's sort of asking for advice and it's asking for commentary, and I think everybody will have something to say about it. And this is from Adam, and he's asking, if you were starting a company that wanted to back a particular fine asset class as an NFT or otherwise, how would you begin building a network, finding funding, etc.? I think it's a really good question, because after all, this conversation is all about everybody who is working with physical asset NFTs. Who would like to start and who would like to comment on Adam's question? Anthony, perhaps you could, because you've described how you went through that process some years ago.
From the land of infinite pain and suffering. Listen, for Adam, I think the issue is always find an asset that everybody, and Teej made a good point on this one, that everyone knows. Property is a big ass asset, so to speak. Everybody knows it. They all feel that it's tangible, it's real. So find an asset that's real to people, that they already inherently trust, that has physical attributes that they can see, touch, feel, and ideally has some utility value. Because that's probably more and more key in the kind of economic cycle we're in right now. So if you can find that, then after that, it's getting the trust systems in place. We've come across it very often in this conversation with this community. It's getting the transparency, the trust. We like DeFi, we like distributed change. I'm going to be a little antagonistic to some on this call. We like distributed change. We like adjudication locally. We like that assets, when they're onboarded, and this is the point we raised with quite a few regulators, it's the onboarding and off ramps, the on-ramps, off-ramps, that they're the ones that you can concentrate on. They're the ones where if you can make sure the asset comes on cleanly, if you make sure the users come on cleanly, then you've got a healthy ecosystem. It's when the on-ramps and off-ramps fail that has a problem. And there was one thing to don't do is don't do the invisible statue that was done in Italy. It works very well for the individual concerned, but it gives us, the rest of us in the industry, hell.
Well, again, Maryna, you described some of your experiences in moving from Web to Web3. Do you have something that you could say to Adam?
Yeah, definitely. I think a piece of advice I would start off with, regardless of whether it's Web2 or Web3, I think it's important to really find an active pain for the end user that you're going to be targeting. And there's this, I see it as a problem actually with the existing Web3 space, that there's innovation with this new exciting blockchain technology that's actually not solving any existential problems. So blockchain, if you choose that solve problems, and if you happen to come by in your work or daily operations, whatever you do, whatever your industry is, you happen to encounter an issue or a friction or something where you could say, oh, there could be some improvement made here, and you could genuinely see the Web3 tools sort of serve a genuine purpose. I think you should go with that for sure. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, let me just add something real quick. So I think both those answers are really interesting. I'd actually like to combine them. I think when you think about bringing assets on chain, you can really think about the auspicious approaches. I think are either on Anthony's side, which is take an asset that there's consensus around its value. People are comfortable with it. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It's not super volatile, right? Like real estate. And find a way to rigorously introduce those assets into whichever players in the ecosystem can either extend balance sheet against it or tokenize it or whatever, right? So that's over here, familiar asset. And then you do all the heavy lifting to make sure the blockchain and that asset can speak to one another. I think Maryna's side is also super interesting, which is focusing on the particular pain points that, if solved, unlock some sort of new service. And so I think, like, when you think about bringing an asset on chain, like, if you can solve certain very difficult Oracle problems, you can actually create completely novel assets, right? And what's beautiful about that is if you're able to create a novel asset and mint it natively on chain, you don't deal with all the path dependencies of trying to force real world assets into this new consensus environment. So for example, just a hypothetical, imagine a protocol that basically it was, it created digital solar receivables. Those receivables basically took the metering rate, the energy harvesting from the photovoltaic panel, and the market rate for whatever energy is. It combines the two, it creates an automatic receivable, right? And that receivable lives on chain. People can finance that or whatever in permissionless liquidity pools. That's a product that does not exist today, right? And you've just sort of created a deterministic Oracle-driven debt product on chain. And so I think it's really one of those two, either familiar asset, do the heavy lifting, or create a completely novel asset that that leverages the fundamental strengths of the blockchain.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Teej. Does anybody else have a comment on or any more suggestions on Adam's question? Ian, please.
I mean, I think it boils down to something that is fundamental to anything that you start, is know your audience. You can come up with wonderful things, but if nobody wants them, they're not going to work. So the key thing is who's likely to want what you're doing, how many of them are there, are they going to interface with the means of supplying this, and are they willing to pay what you will need them to pay? And if none of that works, all the other innovation is going to fall flat on its face.
Thank you, Ian. Does anybody else? Adam says thanks all. So I think we've done our best to answer his question. Does anybody else have anything to add for him?
Do we have time for one more question, or are we going to wrap it here?
We could do one more question. I mean, I can see a few more questions. There's another question from Kate, which I could read out, or she could say. Shall I read it out? Which is
Kate. Kate, do you want to pop on stage for a sec? Oh, going once, going twice.
I could read the question out, which is, I think it's a really nice way to conclude, because everybody here obviously has a vision for a better world. So Kate's question is, name your favorite real world asset use case for social good. What will be better in the world? Who would like to kick that off?
I can give the lazy answer. Not a particular use case, but if you just think about, if we can create a new standard on chain for more assets to access capital markets, right there you have financial inclusion, right? So whether it's you're minting DAI to a family in Argentina, or you're minting DAI against a Kenyan fintech, the idea is if we build these assets on chain, many different groups can access credit that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to access. So that's a public good of sorts.
Thank you very much, Teej.
I have to just come on with a quick one, which will
Please do.
Spice things up before we all go. So one of my colleagues here came up with a design for blockchain marriages. And for those who've been divorced or been through the process, it's a little painful. He's worked out a way to level the playing field. So I'm going to leave that one there. I'm not even going to go there, guys. But
this is very interesting.
With that, I would say trust and distributions from assets of trust, right?
There you go. You're on the path.
Yeah. Another one is honesty, right? Like we saw issues with GameStop, I think last year, where there was more, options sold for shorting GameStop than there were shares out there. And that is one of the biggest things that I like to see in crypto versus stocks, is that everything's provable on chain, and I actually know how much of an asset there is out there And I can see where it's moving, where, you know, there's a lot of systems where we don't have that level of trust and visibility. And so that's one of the things I really look forward to in the blockchain industry, is being able to, you know, make things provable and verifiable, right?
Thank you, David. Would anybody else like to comment on Kate's question?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way that I look at this is that basically you got two sides. You have the facts and then you have the law. And one of the problems that we have right now is that we don't have real good access to facts about things like environmental degradation caused by a product. If I buy a car, or I buy a house, or I buy, you know, 200 tons of steel, or whatever it happens to be, figuring out what the actual environmental footprint of the creation of that thing is very hard. And that's exactly the kind of thing where product information markets and, you know, this kind of freelance Oracle position, you know, gives you the ability to tag the goods with everything that's known about the impact that was there in the creation of those goods. And that ability to actually, you know, attach the ESG information to a data record that is about the object, but is not controlled by the owner of the object, is how you start to generate objective reporting for things like, hey, how much CO2 is produced by this Macintosh that I'm about to buy? And, you know, once you've got that data, you can use it in two ways: voluntary compliance, where you go out and you buy the carbon offsets, or the state comes in and says, right, we're going to levy a carbon tax on that, and we've got some evidence about the CO2 consumption of this thing. Now you'll pay the CO2 footprint of it. And, you know, that approach as we go forward, there aren't many problems in market capitalism that cannot be fixed with accurate pricing of externalities. Almost everything that's wrong with market capitalism is unpriced externalities, whether it's damage to the environment, or whether it's modern slavery, or whether it's fraud. All of these things are about the thing is not what you think it is. You buy something, you don't get what you paid for. The externalities are inflicted on somebody else. And just closing the loops and getting the data into place and just locking it down so that you get exactly what you pay for, and you know the full consequences of your actions. You know, there's a better world to be had there for sure.
Thank you, Vinay. Well, unless anybody else would like to comment on Kate's question, I think we should conclude. Two things. One, folks should claim their Pope, proof of attendance, and the link will be in the chat. I hope we have the correct link. There we are. Brilliant. And next, we have an after party, which is much more kind of free, unrestricted conversation for everyone. You know, everybody will be able to take part. There'll be a separate link for the Zoom for that. We will share that, and it's already been shared once or twice, but we'll share that, and folks will be able to pour themselves a drink, reconnect to that Zoom, and chat much more informally to each other, go into breakout rooms and so on, if you'd like to network. Also, please don't forget to add your name to the spreadsheet if you would like people to be able to contact you and to be able to continue the conversation with you. So you can see the QR code there for the Pope on the screen. Please scan it. Please make a note of the Zoom link for the informal after party. Pour yourself a drink, and we will hopefully see some of you at the after party shortly. Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everybody who asked such brilliant questions. And there is just so much good work going on in the space. It's brilliant to bring everybody together. And we will do this again. Thank you again. Really appreciate everybody's contributions. Thank you so much.